The powerful predator walks with authority, his sharp saber teeth are deadly weapons. He is the terror of that land, the king of a doomed world. He reigns over the Permian floodplains, a land teeming with strange life. Armored reptiles, tusked foragers, and serpentine amphibians. Over many years, the relentless march of time brings more extreme temperatures. Prey becomes scarcer. Volcanic toxins darken the skies. Thus, the delicate balance of life that crowned the predator begins to unravel. Once invincible, the creature now falls as just another victim of the collapse. Just like the fearsome predator, known now as the Gorgonopsian, countless other unimaginable species lived on that Earth during the Permian era. How did this once vibrant land crumble into silence? What creatures ruled these ancient times? And this leads us to wonder, how was life before the Great Dying? "90% extinction rate, a colossal number, marking the vast loss of life some 252 million years ago. It was then that nearly all species, creatures of land and sea, were swept into oblivion. This number alone crowns the Permian Triassic extinction, known as the Great Dying, the darkest chapter in Earth's history. Of the 5 big extinction events in all of natural history, it is by far the most dramatic. For instance, looking at the end Cretaceous mass extinction, which took out the mighty dinosaurs, roughly 70% of species were eliminated. Still an incredibly high number, yet not close to the sheer destruction brought on by the Great Dying. This mass extinction marks the end of the Permian period, and the beginning of the bizarre, tumultuous Triassic. Yet, so devastating was its impact on the world, that it also marks the very end of an era, the Phanerozoic. For nearly 200 million years, complex life had grown to rule the oceans and the land under the ancient Phanerozoic era. Many of the most well-known ancient families of animals, like trilobites, sea scorpions, and ammonites, are staples of this era. It is ironic, then, that this fruitful time in the history of life ends with the Permian. The Phanerozoic begins with the explosion of life into the world, yet ends with its near dissolvement. What follows is the Mesozoic, the time of the dinosaurs, and the birthplace of more modern orders of creatures, like mammals and birds. How did such an event transpire? Hauntingly, the Permian mass extinction was driven by rampant climate change, something we are subject to in the modern day. Yet while our human-driven climate change has unfolded over a mere blink in geologic time, the unchecked global warming at the end of the Permian, fueled largely by a colossal release of carbon dioxide, endured for more than 1 million years. The reason for this release of carbon was the Siberian Traps, located now in central Russia. It was a span of landscape larger than India, belching from underneath the ground mass quantities of lava and billows of carbon-rich fumes, which entered the atmosphere along with other poisonous elements like mercury. Over the course of the 1 million-plus years, the traps were active. CO2 levels in the atmosphere reached an unfathomable 2,000 parts per million. What this massive amount of greenhouse gas wrought on the world is, by no exaggeration, apocalyptic. A drastically changing climate has obvious implications, destabilizing set ecosystems both on land and in water. But other maladies followed suit. Permafrost melting on the Earth's poles released the trapped methane from thawing soils. Thus, more greenhouse gases were released, and the change accelerated. The surplus of CO2 converts to carbonic acid with water, and from the clouds, acid rain pelted the unlucky organisms on the ground. As the ozone layer depleted, ultraviolet radiation penetrated the atmosphere, delivering cancer-causing radiation to any life forms caught in the light. The destruction of terrestrial ecosystems caused a mass die-off in plant cover. This is seen in the Earth's natural archives in what is known as the coal gap, in which coal deposits are absent in early Triassic rock, indicating there were too few plants around to be preserved as coal. The topsoil of the Permian, now depleted of structure-building plant roots, was catastrophically washed downstream. This massive inflow of soil would be dumped into the ocean. Just one of the cataclysmic factors that plagued the seas at this time. The carbonic acid that had poisoned the rain also made its way into the ocean. In a process seen today, ocean acidification made the water inhospitable for some forms of ocean life, possibly caused by the dumping of terrestrial soil and nutrients into the ocean, and thus a boom in algae abundance. The ocean was also depleted of dissolved O2. This deoxygenation further decreased the habitability of the ocean. Such a cataclysmic time in the ocean is affected in the extinction rate. It was the seas, not the land, that was hit the absolute hardest during the Great Dying, with some proposing a 95% estimated species extinction rate for marine life. The levels of destruction wrought on life during the Great Dying were unprecedented, and have not been matched before or since. However, the times that preceded the rise of the Siberian traps were not stable and harmonious times either. In fact, even before the Permian Triassic mass extinction, the organisms of the Permian had already become familiar with climate turmoil and extinction. It was this earlier bout of disaster that would set the stage for the fascinating creatures of the later Permian to rule the world, but leave them vulnerable to another wave of climate peril. It is an unfortunate truth of paleontology that recent bias corrupts the fossil record. Following the principles of recency bias, we find that the further we travel back in time, the less fossil evidence remains to guide us. The Permian period, spanning a vast 300 to 250 million years ago, leaves much of its remarkable history obscured by the sands of time. Yet, the insights we gain about the Permian reveal how significant this chapter was in the story of life. The Capetanian extinction event serves as a powerful example of this dramatic era, highlighting the chaos of existence in those ancient times. The Capetanian extinction might be overshadowed by its predecessor in both attention and overall species destruction. But this earlier extinction event still shares many similarities with the Great Dying. And looking with hindsight back into prehistoric times, the end Capetanian almost acts as a test run for what would come later. For one, the mysterious causes of this extinction event are attributed to another hotspot of volcanic activity. Like the Siberian traps, known scientifically as a large igneous province. This one, located in southern China, This Chinese igneous province was active at the end of the Capetanian Age. From about 263 to 259 million years ago. Some 4 million years. Indeed, unlike the crescendo of disaster at the end of the Permian, this earlier extinction event was a slow burn. Many of the same factors were present in the later extinction, like aridification, ocean acidification, and anoxia. Yet since they occurred at a less severe pace, extinctions did not peak, but rather were a prolonged disturbance. Thus, by the end of its duration, the Capetanian extinction event did not result in a scorched earth per se, but instead an ecological turnover, where, especially on land, the largest rulers of the earth at the time were replaced by new beasts. Most of the terrestrial fossils from the Permian come from one of two places: the fossil beds of Russia or South Africa. It is in South Africa that we get the greatest look at how the Capetanian extinction event affected terrestrial ecosystems. But before we can get into what changed, we must first understand the ensemble of life forms before this extinction. The largest vertebrate life on land during this time were, by and large, synapsids. These primordial animals appear reptilian, but to call them reptiles would be deceptive. In fact, evolutionarily, they are more closely related to you, me, and the rest of the mammal lineage. Evolving from the very earliest reptile-like land dwellers, synapsids possess one hole behind the eye socket in their skulls. Meanwhile, diapsids, the group that includes all living reptiles, birds, and dinosaurs, differed from this by having two of these post-orbital holes. Though this difference may seem insignificant, it ultimately divides these two mighty dynasties for all time. The struggle for dominion over the land has become a persistent theme in terrestrial paleontology. During the Permian period, it was us, the synapsids, who ruled the Earth, showcasing their dominance in this ancient world. The mightiest of the synapsids during this time are still bizarre animals, totally alien to the large mammals that rule today. One of these major groups is the Dinocephalians, translating literally to terrible heads. A very appropriate name looking at some of their representatives. In South Africa, herbivorous moss chops and bulbous-headed tapinocephalus waddled across the landscape, possibly using their thick heads for combat, like modern bighorn sheep. In Russia, an even more grotesque-headed member of this clade, Esteminosuchus, were present. Preying on these giants was another group of carnivorous Dinocephalians, the largest of whom lived in South Africa. At 6 meters in length and 600 kilograms, Anteosaurus was without a doubt the top predator of its environment. Overshadowed by the lumbering Dinocephalians were smaller, scampering synapsids, a part of a clade known as the Dicynodonts. Dicynodonts were herbivorous and most easily distinguished from other groups by their beak and twin tusks. These early Dicynodonts, species such as Diictodon and Robertia, were, for lack of a better term, ugly cute. Diictodon would have been a prairie dog-sized animal, with the ability to create burrows for shelter. Meanwhile, Robertia would be no larger than a hamster. They were maybe some of the only harmless, adorable creatures in this land. Potentially eating up these sausage-shaped prey items was yet another type of synapsid. The Verocephalians were carnivorous, almost dog-like creatures, often depicted with primitive whiskers and sparse hair. Alongside the synapsid cast was the Bradysaurus, a large herbivorous creature that comes from the group known as parareptiles, animals considered a sister group to all modern reptiles. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for them, this would not be the assemblage of animals that remained during the Permian's end. As the Capitanian came to an end, and this ecosystem slowly grew drier and more inhospitable, the largest of these behemoths were driven to extinction. What took their place were a set of new creatures, ones who would inherit the natural world and see it collapse. Firstly, what form did the Earth take during the Permian? Travelling back to this period, the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea was in its prime. Pangaea is one of the few stable components of the time, having been established before the Permian period, and would only begin to break up long after its end. Maybe the most defining trait of Pangaea was the Central Pangaean Mountains, formed from Northern America slamming into Southern America and Africa. During the supercontinent's inception in ages past, the humongous mountains had stopped their growth during the late Permian, but were still a key factor for Pangaea's climate. Tropical rains battered the southern sides of the mountains, but these tall peaks restrained this moisture from reaching the other side. Thus, north of this mountain belt, the northern and central areas of Pangaea were extremely dry and arid places. This interior experienced extreme seasonality, with scorching summers and frigid winters, and would have been one of the harshest places on the whole supercontinent to live. Their animal assemblages have been understudied in paleontology, yet what is known, like the crocodile-like amphibian Nigerpeton, indicates a unique environment with little crossover from other sections of Pangaea, despite the central location of the desert. On the equator, where it wasn't dry, it was very, very wet. Those tropical rains weren't just any old storm, but part of what was called a mega monsoon system. Gaining momentum in the warm seas east of Pangaea, they unleashed their tropical deluges upon the continent's eastern shores. Thus, the eastern corners of the continent, especially the islands within this ocean, were kept in a constantly wet and warm environment. The tropical islands in this ancient eastern sea, known as Paleotethys, are in fact what will consolidate and become the landmass of China later on. Unfortunately, the land life on these islands is not well studied. Jungles make poor places for fossilization. Parasaurs, the clade of large bulky parareptiles Bradysaurus was a part of, have sparse evidence of inhabiting these Chinese islands. Similarly, there is the possibility of the carnivorous therapsids dwelling on these islands. The most interesting of the land-dwelling beasts known from the islands were Croniosuchians. They are speculated to be riverside predators, very much like modern crocodiles. By far their most interesting morphological feature is their set of armor that ran alongside their backbone, which was comprised of interlocking plates that allowed both for defense and flexibility. Looking past these walking animals, Permian China is most known for its marine fossils. Countless marine animals have been discovered, dug up from the tropical coastal sediments that would have surrounded the islands. They show a diverse array of marine crustaceans, bivalves, and fish. The most strange of the animals were the predators. Strange shark-like fish known as helicoprion. Helicoprion comes from a family of strangely toothed fish, others of which swam in the Permian seas. But none are as iconic as its spiral jaw. The exact use and appearance in life was and still is of a great debate among scientists. Nowadays, it is thought the whirl of teeth was used for the consumption of soft-bodied prey like squid, which, once caught, Helicoprion could force the food further back into its throat while shearing it into pieces. The extreme storms and hyper-seasonal weather of Pangaea were, for the most part, confined to the equatorial regions of the supercontinent. In fact, for most of the Permian, global climate was fairly consistent when compared to other eras. Not especially dissimilar to today, although it would heat up to hellish conditions. For a good deal of the time, the Permian period featured ice caps at the South Pole, and even glaciers atop of mountain peaks. In fact, even nearing the end of the Permian, it was very possible glaciers still lined the mighty peaks of the prehistoric Ural Mountains, which were significantly taller than they are today. And unlike the equator, in these higher latitudes, life would have experienced considerably more temperate conditions throughout most of the Permian. Coincidentally, it is these areas of high altitudes, once more represented primarily by fossil beds in Russia and South Africa, where we know the most about the land-dwelling beasts of the late Permian. Both of these areas experienced very ideal fossil-forming qualities. In Russia, those mighty Ural peaks were the source of abundant erosional sediments, allowing for plenty of earth for animals to be buried in. As well, the Urals were the origin of a system of freshwater streams that made their way to the ocean. These formed a system of deltas and streams to create a floodplain environment, one of the optimal settings for fossilization to occur. As the Permian progressed, this landscape grew more and more arid. These perennial bodies of water experienced more seasonal floods of moisture, and the surrounding environment grew more arid. Originally, wetland-adapted trees, possibly some of the earliest of the conifers, dominated this landscape around the bodies of water. But they would be replaced by a shrubbier assemblage of plants. Low-lying bushes of ancient ginkgo-like plants, a now extinct order of plant known as the seed ferns, as well as an ancient type of mosses. On the other side of the continent, South Africa mirrored this floodplain ecosystem with one of its own. Some excellent plant-dominated fossil beds from the region display a landscape sliced by numerous sluggish, meandering rivers. As well, this environment is dotted by stagnant pools of water, like oxbow lakes, an interesting natural phenomenon that occurs when a meandering branch of a river is cut off from flowing water. The banks of freshwater bodies were choked by a type of tree known as the Glossopteris, a particularly distinct, leafy tree found all across the southern reach of Pangaea, and one of the most identifiable plants from the Permian. Another ancient plant in this environment is still with us today. Horsetails, or rather their relatives, would be found throughout the wet habitat. Similarly to Russia, as the Permian came to a close, the land got drier. Surviving rock suggests the serene lakes and stagnant oxbow ponds of the area faded away and vanished. The rivers lost their meandering quality, becoming more powerful braided streams. Indeed, plant fossils from the latest Permian drop off precipitously. But exactly how much is caused by the dying or by a shift in their depositional environments remains unknown. These two separate environs preserving a seasonally wet, temperate setting ripe for fossil formation, and separated by the immense expanse of Pangaea, are our best looks into this fascinating time. Despite the distance between them, there are several marked similarities in each site's animal assemblage, although the specifics of how they differentiate will not go without discussion. No matter how similar or different, the animals of South Africa and Russia would meet the same fate: mass extinction at the hands of an uncontrollable force. The adorable dicynodonts from the earlier Capitanian would cast a much larger shadow by the later period, with the large herbivores of their era disappearing into the sands of time. These scrappy, rodent-sized synapsids grew to fill their place, quite literally. The dicynodonts of the late Permian were not comprised of small burrowers, but large, boar-like herbivorous animals. Their strong beaks and specialized skulls would have been excellent tools in chopping up vegetation for sustenance. The tusks protruding down from the upper jaws might have been useful in digging up plant matter from the ground whilst foraging, or possibly for some other flashier purpose like to display or threaten. They had sprawling, waddling gaits, with legs placed to the sides of their bodies like reptiles. This, combined with their bulk, would not have made them the most fleet-footed of animals. Certain species show signs of muscular forearms. So maybe, much like their smaller cousins, the animals could make a protective shelter by burrowing into the ground. Of course, size might have limited the larger species as effective burrowers. Indeed, it's possible strong arms were most useful for digging up plants while a dicynodont was foraging. There are many species of these larger pig-like dicynodonts found across the late Permian world, but none might be as iconic as the Lystrosaurus. Found across Pangaea and ranging from the size of a small dog to a hefty boar, Lystrosaurus diversified into a handful of very successful species. But what is most interesting about Lystrosaurus is what happens to it after the Permian period. Just like how dicynodonts survived the Capitanian, they just barely survived the Great Dying. Of the several Lystrosaurus species, just one made it to the beginning of the Triassic. Yet this singular species would be greatly rewarded for making it through the gauntlet of the Great Dying. With the rest of Pangaea void of nearly any other species of large land animal, this one Lystrosaurus species would explode in abundance, and by sheer numbers, dominate the supercontinent to a level unprecedented by a single species. A fossil layer in South Africa during the early Triassic is comprised of a Lystrosaurus hypermajority, who make up an astounding 95% of the fossils in the rock. Why exactly the single Lystrosaurus species and not the other dicynodonts survived is still up in the air. Yet the emergence of larger herbivorous dicynodonts like Lystrosaurus does not cast the smaller ones into the shadows. Rather, they thrived alongside their plodding kin. Diictodon continued living into the late Permian just like it did in the Capitanian. But inserted into this guild of small burrowing dicynodonts were stranger, more specialized members. From fossils in South Africa, we get Cysticephalus, one of the very first dicynodonts described, Cysticephalus evolved some very interesting traits that hint that it went all in on the burrowing lifestyle. To describe it as a prehistoric mole wouldn't be a stretch. Alongside a long tubular body and stout muscular forelimbs is a flat head whose sides taper to a point. Many burrowing adapted animals of today have a skull shape that is very similar. Like a shovel, it allows a digging creature to force its way headfirst through the dirt with relative ease. As well, Cysticephalus possesses binocular vision, something which is quite odd for a dicynodont, or even a herbivorous animal, to evolve. Binocular vision is usually attributed for the purposes of spotting and tracking down prey items. So possibly, Cysticephalus was a predator of small invertebrates in the dirt, much like the moles of today. It has been difficult for paleontologists to place the family of dicynodonts with precision on the scale of furry mammal to scaly reptile, because even though synapsids may have split from true reptiles, they obviously have several reptilian-like traits, such as their limbs splayed to the side. But overall, dicynodonts seem to have some remarkably mammalian traits. There is some significant evidence from the vascularization of the bones and the structure of the skull that supports these animals possessing a warm-blooded nature. Indeed, their stout, compact bodies and affinity for digging burrows would have been very useful for sustaining internal body heat. Some of the most fascinating evidence for dicynodonts' more mammalian attributes comes from coprolite, or fossilized dung. The dung, which likely came from a carnivore who preyed on and killed dicynodonts, features a great multitude of hair. This fascinating pre-mammalian hair supports that dicynodonts and some other groups of synapsids were covered in some kind of fur. Most conservatively, a light, wispy coat. Among the other herbivores of the later Permian were those parasaurs from earlier. In the south, this family is represented by their namesake, Parasaurus. Meanwhile, in Russia, there roamed the Scutosaurus, a common animal in these fossil beds, with several complete skeletons known. Indeed, although South Africa is dominated by dicynodont fossils, the Russian herbivore assemblage is most well known for producing Scutosaurus. Indeed, it's possible that while dicynodonts ruled the south and Pangaea, parasaurs had a firm hold of the north. Within their wide, bumpy skulls is set a couple dozen leaf-shaped teeth, perfect for slicing up plants. They were clearly effective herbivores. These animals were large, reaching around a metric ton in weight. As well, they held their huge barrel-shaped bodies on elephantine legs set to their sides like reptiles. So they would have been very slow to flee. In response to predation, the parasaurids' main solution was not speed, but armor. They were covered head to toe in rough, warty osteoderms, innumerable bony scales that lay under the skin. Unlike the stiff armor of an armadillo or turtle, this still gave the Parasaurus flexibility and the ability to bend the armor sections of their bodies. Indeed, it acted much like the studded leather armor of medieval warriors. Alongside this, their bones were stout and dense, and muscles thick, especially around the neck. This would have made the parasaurs wandering tanks, able to put up a stiff defense against any predator's attack. But who exactly were the predators parasaurs were armored up against and dicynodonts were cowering from? By far the most well-known as icons of the late Permian predators were the awesome yet alien Gorgonopsians. Throughout the late Permian, these Gorgonopsians reigned as apex predators, prowling the continent from the temperate embraces of Africa and Russia to the desolate arid stretches in between. They were mighty killers, whose size matched Earth's modern predators. The largest, like Russia's Inostransivia, grew as large as a bear, at 3 meters and 300 kilograms. How they became so large and successful appears to be an ingenious evolutionary combination of several reptilian and mammalian traits. For one, there is no evidence Gorgonopsians possessed body hair of any kind, or any evidence they were warm-blooded. Despite this, Gorgonopsians did not have a properly splayed gait. Their limbs were much closer to being underneath them than the other synapsids at the time. This suggests they would have been significantly more nimble and agile than other synapsids. In a land where their prey plodded along in awkward gaits, Gorgonopsians would stand out for modern, almost cat-like movements and agility. Yet another of their more cat-like traits is also the Gorgonopsians' most striking. Within a rectangular, powerfully built skull were a set of saber teeth. Not all dissimilar to the piercing fangs of the saber-toothed cats, who would come along some 250 million years later. This phenomenon stands as a striking testament to convergent evolution. A tale where two distant relatives independently forge identical weapons in the struggle for survival. Alongside these frightening fangs, Gorgonopsians had a fascinating jaw. One that was able to hinge open at an incredibly wide 90-degree angle. Outside of the head, Gorgonopsians were assisted in killing by their burly forearms. Their hands were surprisingly dexterous and nimble for such powerfully built synapsids. The flexibility Gorgonopsians possessed in their hands indicate they were an additional killing tool. The claws able to grasp at a prey animal, as the Gorgonopsian's mouth dealt lethal blows. Much like saber-toothed cats, it is not known for certain how such a predator used their striking fangs. Even more confusingly, Gorgonopsians and saber cat teeth, although having similar appearances, possess structural differences. This frustratingly means evidence gathered on how saber-toothed cats killed their prey may have no bearing on what Gorgonopsians did. It's been proposed the general means a Gorgonopsian bite inflicted injury was through a puncture and pull technique. According to this theory, the teeth of the Gorgonopsians would punch through the flesh of a prey animal, and while biting down, the teeth were pulled away from the initial wound, ripping through flesh and inflicting grievous damage. However, the exact specifics of how they killed almost certainly differed between different sections of Gorgonopsian family. For most of the Permian, this family of predators were divided on a north-south basis. In Russia, Inostransivia persisted, a testament to resilience in a harsh world. These tended toward the longest saber teeth among the Gorgonopsians. As well, their skulls were less robustly built, with a weaker bite force than others. This suggests these animals were killed by prioritizing the saber teeth alone as the main weapon. The fangs would pierce flesh and slice up vital arteries and organs. Several of these saber specialists persisted in the southern hemisphere. Yet overall, the south was dominated by a different family of Gorgonopsians, represented by species like the intimidating Dinogorgon or wide-headed Rubidgia, who employed the opposite strategy. Their skulls were especially strong and robust, and indeed they may have employed one of the most powerful bite forces in the animal kingdom. It is through these gaping jaws they would bite down, propelling teeth to puncture with indiscriminate crushing power, crippling the poor prey animal. For most of the Permian, this divide of Gorgonopsian subfamily persisted, between the precise saber killers of Inostrancivia and the brutish crushers of Rubidgia. Yet nearing the end of the Permian, something remarkable happened. With the Great Dying on the horizon and environments changing, a recent study reveals the southern Gorgonopsians disappeared and were replaced by the northern Gorgonopsians. Indeed, in the face of ecological upheavals, top predators are some of the first animals to disappear from the environment. So the paper proposes that these southern Gorgonopsians initially fell to extinction, and northern Gorgonopsians moved in to fill the niche of apex predator. However, these new apex predators did not get to enjoy their reign over prehistoric South Africa for very long. Soon after they assumed control, they too faced extinction, and were in turn erased from the local fossil record, and replaced by another group of predators, the Therocephalians. The name Therocephalian means beast head, an apt description of their overall biology. These synapsids possessed huge heads that made up a disproportionate amount of their overall mass. For instance, Moscorinus, one of the largest of the Therocephalians, and the Gorgonopsians' replacement, had a body length of 1.5 meters, yet a skull as large as a lion's. Similarly to Gorgonopsians, the huge head was lined with massive canine teeth. But these weren't the elegant curved sabers of their synapsid relatives. Rather, they were like a pair of massive railway spikes, columnar and straight. The long, robust fangs, along with the other teeth present in the jaw, give evidence Moscorinus hunted most similarly to big cats of today, in which the strong canines are thrust into the struggling prey, and remain in the animal thanks to a robust skull and unyielding muscles, as its life is slowly drawn from it. Some other traits of this predator were remarkably cat-like. As discussed before, other Therocephalians show evidence of whiskers on their face and hair. But alongside this, signs of warm-bloodedness. If these traits carried on to Moscorinus, this species would give the Permian world a taste of a mammal-like apex predator 200 million years before the true mammal's own rise to land dominance. There were other Therocephalians around in the late Permian besides the intimidating Moscorinus. A similarly predatory Therocephalian, Skylacosuchus, lived in Russia alongside the other northern beasts. As a whole, the group was yet another successful lineage of animals spread across the entire continent. They also evolved outside of this predatory role into many other weird and wonderful forms. In the shadow of the mighty Moscorinus prowled a slender-snouted guild of Therocephalians, whose lithe forms and quick movements mirrored that of a modern-day weasel. A group of small Therocephalians, represented by the species Perlovia, retained large canines, but lost their remaining sharp teeth. It is hypothesized they went the route of simple herbivores, humbly foraging on the Permian landscape. Another group of these animals took a much more sinister turn. One group of predatory Therocephalians is most well represented by the species Eucambersia, found from Africa to China, which grew to the size of a small dog, but unorthodox traits in its skull prove it might have been a lot deadlier than what meets the eye. Eucambersia had a large cavity in its upper jaw, along with a canal that connected this cavity to its sharp, ridged teeth. Off of these aspects of the anatomy, it is hypothesized Eucambersia and its relatives were venomous killers. Caustic venom stored in glands within the upper mouth would be channeled to the sharp teeth, where, after a successful bite, a prey item of Eucambersia would face a painful, chemically enhanced death. This possible evidence of venom is some of the oldest in the entire fossil record, and proves even in early ages, predators evolved sophisticated techniques of taking out their victims. Therocephalians, like dicynodonts, survived the Permian Triassic extinction event, if in limited numbers. The mighty Moscarinus, for instance, survived the dying, but its abundance and body size are reduced afterward, and soon they are replaced by newer Triassic predators. But another group of synapsids had a much more long-lasting legacy after the Permian. This group is the cynodonts, very closely related to the Therocephalians, and looked a great deal like them. Furthermore, they likely possessed some of the more primitive traits associated with all synapsids at this time, like egg-laying. But after the Great Dying, cynodonts would diversify rapidly, and eventually, one branch of cynodonts would become the class of mammals, from which all mammals today, big and small, descend. The families of animals talked about so far were the groups with the largest, most attention-grabbing roles in the late Permian ecosystem. Savage predators and lumbering herbivores are oftentimes all we talk about when looking back into the fossil record. But there were, to equal importance to the doomed environment, a litany of other strange arcane monsters who populated the supercontinent. At the time, the synapsid predators who strode across the land were the newest alphas of the continent. And the Permian is characterized by their dominance. But the stunning success of synapsid predators should not overshadow another group of monsters. One who came much earlier. Brooding in the water was an ancient lineage of primitive amphibians, the temnospaundals. This is the group from which the equatorial Niger-Peton descends. The knowledge that a lineage of water-dependent amphibians somehow thrived in such an arid environment as the middle of Pangaea should be enough to prove how hardy the temnospaundals were. They originated more than 30 million years before the start of the Permian. Despite this, the temnospaundals would be some of the few animals to survive the Great Dying. Albeit going extinct in the preceding Mesozoic, but not after more than 100 million years of evolution after the Permian. Temnospaundals were not to be trifled with. And even the saber-toothed Gorgonopsians would have had to be cautious around the water's edge. One South African species, Uranosentrodon, grew almost 4 meters long. In Russia, the sole temnospaundal Divinosaurus grew some 2.5 meters. These giant amphibians also had some other interesting quirks. Bone near the neck implies the temnospaundals of the late Permian possessed gills, Unlike the external gills of some modern amphibians like the axolotl, Temnospondyls' gills were probably internal based on their structure. Uranocentrodon also possessed armor via osteoderms across its torso, perhaps as additional defense from other aggressive temnospondyls. These fearsome crocodile-like amphibians had weak forelimbs that prevented them from moving gracefully on land. Deep water, particularly deep river channels, were their optimal habitat. They would have waited on the bottom of the riverbed in ambush, before propelling themselves forward with the twitch of their powerful tail and catching an unsuspecting victim in their vast maws. There is evidence supporting temnospondyls being generalists, preying on fish, other aquatic beasts, or an unfortunate land dweller that stayed too long for a drink. This contrasts with the Cronioseuchians, assumed fish specialists. Other ancient relics, even in the context of the Permian period, dwelled within these freshwater habitats. Crawling across the murky bottoms were giant arthropods, raking through the sediment, looking for morsels of food to consume. These grotesque bugs were in fact from an ancient lineage that once ruled the waters, the Eurypterids, better known as sea scorpions, but not related to scorpions at all. Eurypterids had already seen the peak of their order come and go in ages long past. Previous mass extinctions dwindled their numbers down to where only a few holdouts remained by the time of the Great Dying. These last genera of Eurypterids are also very rare in the late Permian fossil records, indicating these last few groups had a very sparse presence across the Pangaean continent, making it unsurprising they were completely wiped out by the end of the Permian. Ironically, these last species of sea scorpion were not at all marine animals. They had abandoned the seas for shallow freshwater environments. They could not swim like their ancient relatives. Instead, they had to walk on the riverbed with segmented legs. They could even crawl onto land for short periods of time. But their weight, outside of water's buoyant properties, made them awkward and slow walkers. The Eurypterids of the late Permian got large indeed, over 1 meter in length in some cases, with robust, bulky carapaces. Together, along with the temnospondyls, Cronioseuchians, and an ensemble of other water dwellers, the Permian rivers and lakes would have been a rich ecosystem. Yet another ancient group of animals who had limped along to the later Permian were the iconic trilobites. At this time in their history, trilobites, a dynasty of animals who had existed at the Phanerozoic's inception in the Cambrian period, and continued on for more than 200 million years, were reduced to just one group. This group, the order Proetida, specialized in living in the shallows of the ocean, on the continental shelf. They crawled among a myriad of other incredible marine invertebrates, many of which, sponges, sea lilies, and bivalves, are still around. Yet when ocean shallows were profoundly affected by the end Permian climate crisis, this specific environment was surely decimated beyond repair. The groups who were durable and numerous enough survived. But this final vulnerable group of trilobites would be one of many to be hit the hardest and face complete extinction. Trekking back onto dry land, The Pangean continent was filled with many odd animals who did not fit into the major groups focused on earlier. Within several Russian fossil formations exists an interesting type of synapsid. They are closely related to the dicynodonts, yet lack many of their features or their continent-spanning success. In the late Permian, they were represented by a singular species, Suminia. This cat-sized animal may have been small in stature, but its legacy for all of us tetrapods, that is, all land-dwelling vertebrates. Suminia possesses several strange traits: elongated limbs, a long, flexible tail, and its first digit shows the ability to flex independently of the others, what you might call an opposable thumb. Off of these traits, scientists believe Suminia was the very first arboreal, or tree-dwelling, tetrapod in all of natural history. With the help of its opposable thumbs, and possibly a prehensile tail much like a monkey's, Suminia would have climbed through the prehistoric Permian canopy, snacking on fibrous plant matter to fuel its high-climbing nature. Though modest in size, Suminia's form became the blueprint for every arboreal tetrapod that followed. An ancestral design that would one day open the canopy to countless creatures. Another strange group of synapsids, overshadowed by the more numerous clades, with the Bernetidids. This was a group of carnivorous synapsids, not especially large, about dog-sized, but certainly ferocious creatures worth fearing. They were characterized by bumped, knobby skulls, with bony ornamentations across their surface. Although this makes the resemblance uncanny, Bernetidids were not especially closely related to the strange-skulled Dinocephalians. Bernetidid remains are found across the continents. However, in the most major fossil formations in Russia and South Africa, their fossils are always exceedingly rare. It is possible Bernetidids occupied a niche that kept them perpetually elusive in their environment, overshadowed by the other predatory animals. Or perhaps the rare fossils we know represent the Bernetidids at the periphery of their range. This hypothesis states that the floodplain basins on each end of Pangaea, scarce of Bernetidids, were only the perimeter of the beast's range, where naturally they would be less abundant. Perhaps the interior of Pangaea was chock full with Bernetidids. But once more, we are limited by the realities of biases in the fossil record. Although the Permian may have been the age of the synapsid, there were still plenty of reptile groups. The largest might have been the hulking paraiosaurs, but there were many other smaller species scampering within the underbrush. Many were lizard-like animals. Although not related to the modern lizards in any substantial way. Another example of convergent evolution replaying over and over again. Some evolved odder body shapes and lifestyles. The 2-meter-long Protorosaurus had elongated legs and neck, resembling almost the modern carnivorous monitor lizard. Numerous small, sharp teeth also support a similar lifestyle, yet fossilized gut contents of Protorosaurus reveal plant matter, betraying this odd reptile as a herbivore. Tangosaurus stands out as a rare aquatic oddity, wielding a long paddle-like tail to glide through the ancient waters. But far and away, the strangest of these reptiles did not live in the water, but in the trees. A family of reptiles known across Europe and Madagascar, called the Wygiltisaurs, were smaller arboreal insect eaters. By and large, they look much like any other lizard-esque animal, save for the torso. On its flanks were dozens of pairs of rod-like bones, sticking out laterally from the animals' bodies. These were used seemingly to assist in gliding, much like flying squirrels nowadays. This would denote them as the first group of tetrapods to attempt gliding. The first in a long line of evolutionary experiments among tetrapods to take over the sky. So clearly, late Permian Pangaea was a complex and strange world, filled with many savage beasts on land, ancient oddities in the water, and wondrous creatures even in the trees and the sky. Yet for how many miraculous things have been discovered? Even more species from the late Permian, across the vast extent of Pangaea in its myriad of extreme environments, have not yet been dug up. But once again, this diverse environment would be swept off the face of the earth. 9/10 of the species erased from the globe in the wake of the Great Dying. Among those lost, the saber-toothed Gorgonopsians, the Paraeosaur prey, the once dominant relicts of the Permian waters, trilobites and sea scorpions, the bizarre gliding Wygiltisaurs, and countless others. Still, 250 million years later, the Permian-Triassic mass extinctions remain the closest we have ever come to the complete destruction of complex life. Yet from this time of catastrophe for the ruling animals of the Permian, and the Paleozoic as a whole, came the opportunity for a new set of animals to rise. Starting in the Triassic, continuing out through the Mesozoic and current Cenozoic, is what scientists call Earth's modern faunal assemblage. Although mainly defined by marine fauna, such as the radiation and domination of mollusks in the ocean after the Permian, it has connotations among all ecosystems. For instance, on land, it is only through the extinguishing of the Permian fauna that modern reptiles, from which evolved birds and all mammals, were able to flourish. So, despite the sheer terror it may invoke in name alone, the Great Dying ironically led to the abundant diversity of life as we know it now, including you and me. Of course, any enthusiast in paleontology should never forget what came before. Far from primitive and dull animals, the creatures of the late Permian are just as complex and brilliantly adapted as any to come after their reign. Before Ice Age monsters or giant dinosaurs, they were the ones to lay out the blueprints of how to rule the land. And it's no coincidence so many younger creatures seem to take inspiration from late Permian animals. They were much more than just victims of a great extinction. What came before the Great Dying was the culmination of life before, and the architects for what would come after.